Good morning. My name is Eric McGhee, and I'm a Policy Director and Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today. We are featuring the findings from PPIC's report on how the Voters' Choice Act changed turnout in California. The report, the technical appendix, for those of you who are excited to read that kind of thing, the policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can be found on our website at ppic.org. The research and event are supported with generous funding from the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. We'd like to thank them so much for their support of this work. For today's program, I will present some of the key findings from the report before turning to questions from the audience. If you have such a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. It's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. All right, with all of that out of the way, on to the presentation. Let me get this slide up. All right, so this report, the title is pretty self-explanatory. We're looking at the effects on turnout of one of the signature voting reforms passed in a period of time in California when there were quite a few significant voting reforms that were passed. So this one is a big one, the Voters' Choice Act. It is really the biggest one that applies strictly to and specifically to the process of voting itself, of turning in a ballot. A lot of the other reforms concern registration. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of review where things are at with this this important reform and to see what the effects were on participation in elections. The Voters' Choice Act is like a voting reform package. You have to, if you're a county that adopts the Voters' Choice Act, you have to agree to do a bunch of different things all at once. One of them is to send every voter a ballot in the mail by default, so everyone gets one. You switch from the normal process of a bunch of polling places staffed by volunteers to a smaller number of professionally staffed vote centers. And those vote centers differ from a normal polling place in the sense that they are available, among other ways, they are available to every county resident. So you can go to any vote center in the county that you want to. And that the intention there is to make the process more convenient. The reform also requires a certain number of drop boxes that are made available 28 days before the election, a certain amount of early voting made 10 days before with an increase 3 days before, and so the early voting being a staff location, and then some formal engagement that you have to do with the community during the transition to help everybody adjust to the new system. The in-person voting citing requirements are pretty different for the VCA. In a traditional polling place county, you have to have one polling place for about every 1,000 registered voters. For vote centers, it's about one for 50,000 10 days prior and one for 10,000 3 days prior to the election. The drop-box requirements are much more significant for VCA counties, and you can see for every jurisdiction, it's one for 30,000. For VCA counties, it's one for 15,000. And so you end up with a lot more of those kinds of options, kind of an unstaffed opportunity relative to the traditional county. The counties decide whether they want to adopt this system. It's a voluntary thing for each county. They can decide to make the switch. But if they make the switch, all the changes have to be adopted together. One key thing about the VCA that has changed, and it's not necessarily about the VCA itself, but about California in general, since the pandemic, everybody gets a ballot in the mail by default. So every county in the state is like a VCA county now in that sense. So that means that the real change to voting that the VCA now produces is about the in-person voting experience and all those changes that I just showed to you, and not really about whether you're getting that ballot in the mail. And so that's key, that what we're looking at in this study is, and when we're looking at the effect of the VCA, is we're really looking at the effect of these changes in in-person options. The VCA is very popular. A little over half the counties have adopted it, but they're almost all of the big counties have adopted it. So about 3/4 of registered voters now use the VCA in various parts of the state. And there's just this map just shows you how it's kind of spread over time to include most of the biggest counties. So what we want to look at is, what we wanted to look at with this report was the effects of the VCA on voter turnout, and maybe a little bit why we saw the effects that we did. So we ask, has overall turnout increased or declined under the VCA? So just like the top line number in VCA counties. Has the VCA especially improved turnout for young voters and voters of color? Is another thing that we look at. And then why, if we see whatever patterns we see, why might we see the patterns we do? There are a lot of different kind of mechanisms by which the VCA might change the voting experience. It's changing, as I suggested, the distance to your nearest voting location, even though you can choose any one you want. There are fewer of them. There's a certain amount of disruption to any kind of new system, and so there is this disruptive element that may be more keenly felt by those who have less experience with the voting process, or who are going to see a bigger change. And then there's just kind of the length of time with the VCA. Do you kind of learn the system regardless of whether there's disruption or not? Are you more acclimated to the system the longer that you use it? So how do we answer these questions? Well, first we compare a couple of midterm elections, the 2018 to the 2022, and then a couple of presidentials, 2020 to 2024. That allows us to sort of compare apples to apples. Midterms and presidentials may have different turnout dynamics, and so we wanted to kind of compare like to like. In each case, we compare counties that switched to the VCA during this point in time, between these 2 points in time, to counties that did not switch. So in some cases, that means we are comparing to VCA counties, but VCA counties that used the VCA during both elections. So they didn't actually switch their voting system. And we look at a couple different types of voters. One we call continuing, which is people who were registered in both election years, and we identify them in both voter files. We merge the voter files together, and we identify people at both points in time. And that really allows us to account for a lot of the other explanations that might account for the patterns that we see, because we're looking at actually the very same people at 2 points in time. And really the only thing that when we're doing this right, the only thing that's really changed is whether they use the VCA for voting or not. And then we looked at young people, 18 to 19-year-olds who can't be continuing because they're new to elections, but because they're 18 to 19, they're young, which is an important group for these reforms to understand the impact. But also they literally, it's like their first election, fall general election, where they can have participated. So it's making that comparison and seeing how that compares to the continuing voters. All right, so diving right into the results, what are the overall effects for continuing voters, for those who we have at 2 points in time? Well, in the midterm elections, we actually saw in VCA counties the turnout decline. So it's worth noting that turnout between each of these elections, between 2018 and 2022, and between 2020 and 2024, turnout declined all over the state. So what we're looking for here is not a sign that the VCA increased turnout between those two elections, but just that it maybe didn't decline as much in a VCA county. So that's what you're seeing here, is these declines. Every type of county had a decline, but the VCA counties, between the two midterms, the decline was actually a little bit larger. The opposite was true in the presidential election. So we actually saw a little bit of an increase in the VCA county. So there's a different dynamic going on in these two different elections. When we looked at this for voters of color, it was particularly, for the midterms, it was particularly Latinos who saw a decline between these two elections, between 2018 and 2022. And then again, most voters saw some increase between the presidentials, but Black voters actually did see a decline between those two presidentials. The same thing for young voters. It's basically the same pattern as for overall. So decline in the midterms, between the midterms, a small increase in the presidentials. So one possible dynamic that's going on here is that, especially for those midterms, is whether the distance to your nearest voting location is explaining some of the reasons we saw a decline between those elections. And so for first, for continuing voters here, we looked at, what was your nearest location for a traditional polling place county? That's going to be your polling place in almost every case. In the VCA counties, you can go to any location you want, but maybe that nearest one might have some special significance for you. Might not, right? So we're not saying that it does necessarily mean anything, because you could go to some place that's farther away if it was close to your work or to errands that you're running, that kind of thing. So what do we see from this distance? So we, first of all, just to reiterate that there has been a change in distance. So this is all the VCA counties, and you see that anything positive is an increase in distance from before and after they switched to the VCA, and they're all positive. And then in traditional counties, it's much more of a mix, and the changes are much smaller. So this is pretty consistent with the idea that the VCA is, in fact, there's fewer locations, and so the median person is going to be, the typical person is going to be farther away. So what do we see? If you look at this plot, this is, again, for continuing voters, so it's showing, we're able to show changes in your distance. So like how far away were you in 2018, and then how much farther away you were in 2022. Oh, I should also note that we weren't able to do this same analysis for the presidential election, so this is just limited to the midterms. So across the horizontal axis, we've got tenths of a mile. So any negative number is you're getting closer to your nearest location, and anything positive, you're getting farther away. And the size of the circles here is the number of registered voters we're talking about. And what we would expect if there was an effective distance, which has been found in other research, I should note, is that as you go from the left of this plot down to the right, it should slope downward, because turnout should decline as you get farther away from as you're moved farther away from your location. But yet the change in turnout is pretty flat across the whole thing, suggesting not much effect of distance. And in fact, for just in a very slight sense, it actually climbs a little bit as you get to the farthest distances, which is the opposite of what you would necessarily expect. We look at the same thing for young voters. Oh, I should note that when we break this out by race and ethnicity, Latinos do show some larger effects at the farthest distances, but mostly because the turnout actually climbs much more for Latino voters who are at the farthest distances, and it doesn't climb at all in the VCA counties. In the traditional counties, it climbs, and then in the VCA counties, it doesn't. So there is a little bit of an effect there. Overall, though, the patterns are largely the same. For young voters, basic same story. It climbs a little bit more as you get farther out. Worth noting here that we're no longer looking at changes in distances, because there's no change in distance to talk about with somebody who's voting for the first time. So this is just their absolute distance from their nearest location, and that might affect the results a little bit, but the basic story and the basic conclusion is the same, which is it's not a lot of effect, and if there is an effect, it's kind of the opposite of what we might think. All right, so that's distance. What about just disruption to voting? And the way that we define this is how much change did you experience in switching to the VCA? People who were previously voting by mail and showed a preference to vote by mail should have kind of the smallest amount of disruption, because they don't have to worry about what's going on necessarily with the in-person voting. They can just do the same thing they did in the last election, mail in their ballot, right? And then you should see more disruption for those who had voted in person before or who had not voted at all and so had less experience with just voting in general. And that is more or less what we see. So in the midterm elections, you see that the counties that switched to the VCA, the turnout was decline was larger for those who, this is the blue bars here, was larger for those who didn't vote, and we go back a little bit in time. So in this case, it's you didn't vote in 2016, or you voted in person in 2016, and then for the presidential comparison, it's whether how you voted in 2018. And what we see is there is, in fact, like those who had that more disruptive experience had a bigger decline. Continuing with the kind of the confusing nature of some of these findings, that we actually see like some of the same in the presidentials. The people who voted in person in 2018 actually saw some of the biggest increases. So definitely something different going on between these midterms and the presidentials. And I will say, like, again, when you look at this by race and ethnicity, it's generally Latinos who have the biggest decline for those voted in person and didn't vote. And again, Black voters in the presidentials. What about the amount of time that you've had with the VCA? Do you have a little bit more experience with it? So we define that as counties that adopted earlier and then counties that adopted later. And so for the 2018 to 2022 comparison, it's counties that adopted in 2020 versus those that adopted in 2022. For the presidential comparison, it's those that adopted in 2022 versus those that adopted in 2024. And when we compare, and we do this same, like didn't vote, voted by mail, voted in person. Really, there's a lot going on in this plot, but the basic message is the result is often the opposite of what we would expect. So the longer experience had a lower turnout. It is worth noting for the presidential comparison that there's actually a little bit of a typo here. That it should say for those kind of orangish bars, it should say switched in 2022 and switched in 2024. So apologies for that. But what we're seeing in the ones who switched in 2024 was Placer and Humboldt, and it's just a couple of counties. And so there's, it's possible there's something special about those counties, and maybe we shouldn't make too much of it. But nonetheless, it's not showing you the pattern that you would expect, which is the ones that are with it longer would have the smaller declines in turnout. All right, so what are our conclusions and recommendations? Conclusion is just a summary of what we found, which is kind of mixed effects. In the midterms, there's a decline. In presidentials, there's an increase. And the thing I haven't really mentioned overall is that there's kind of a small overall effect, right? It's not a lot. Sometimes for certain groups, it is a little, in certain elections, it's a little larger. But probably the larger story here, the more overall story, is that the VCA is not having huge effects one way or the other for this in-person voting component. There are, however, some negative effects for Latino and Black voters in certain elections, and we want to understand what's going on there. Some possible explanations we looked at, really small effects for distance to voting, sometimes large effects for disruption in certain cases in certain elections, and then the time with reform is really the opposite of what would be expected. So what do we need? Well, we probably need better outreach to voters who prefer voting in person. That's one of these findings. They have occasionally had trouble, at least in the midterms. And so it's probably worth considering better outreach to those voters in particular. It's for people who have that history. We need a better understanding of the VCA voter experience, especially for Latino and Black voters. So we need to kind of dig into this to understand. Again, it wasn't always a problem, but it was sometimes a problem. And we want to understand kind of maybe better what's going on and what led to those problems. Was it just a one-time anomaly? Was it something that is more consistent and that we need to address? It really doesn't seem like more in-person voting locations will help much with turnout. Which is kind of a surprising finding because in other research conducted in other states, the general conclusion is the farther away you are, the harder it is for you to vote. But it may be those were all conducted in states that didn't have all vote by mail. Because California is an all vote by mail state, it may just be a good fallback for voters when they get too far out. And that might actually explain why the turnout actually rises a little bit as you get farther out from voting, because it induces those voters to just go ahead and mail in their ballot, whereas the ones who are closer in keep thinking, you know what, I'm going to go and vote in person. It's going to happen, and then they just don't end up doing it, and that they miss the opportunity. So that may be what's going on with this dynamic, in that sense that we don't really have to worry as much about distance in a place like California as we would in a state that had a more traditional system where you have to sign up for a vote by mail. And the local context can color all of these patterns. There's a lot of county variation besides just the VCA, so I don't want to pretend like that's the only thing that's going on. So we want to keep that in mind, and there's opportunities for more exploration here. So as I said at the beginning, submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and I am happy to take those questions now. All right, so one question is, so again, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So one question, very good question, is I keep mentioning Latinos and Blacks. What about voting patterns for Asian communities? We do look at them in the report. It just, there isn't a whole lot going on for Asian Americans. The patterns are not that different from the overall patterns. They aren't in some cases there, but there's not really a sign of Asian Americans struggling with these with the VCA in the way that was true sometimes for Latinos and Blacks, and so that's why we didn't call it out in this presentation, but the information is in the report. What do I think accounts for the difference in overall turnout between the midterm elections and the presidential elections? That is an excellent question. The dynamics of turnout in those two types of elections are different. The voter who's just on the cusp of participating is different in each kind of election. There's a real presidential elections draw in a lot of people, and it may just be that kind of tipping point voter is a different has a different participation history. It's definitely something that's worth exploring in the future, because we don't have necessarily a great explanation for it in this report, but it's definitely one of the dynamics that's going on a lot in the findings. So I wish I could have something more satisfying to say about that. And we also are going to have to see if that pattern continues when we get to 2026, or if it was kind of unique to those two election years. We do have the pandemic going on during all of this time, and so that kind of might mess things up as well. Do we have a sense of how all vote by mail is working for California? So I have talked about the in-person changes, which is what was the focus of this report, but obviously we also switched to being all vote by mail. We have actually looked at that question in past PPIC research, and there's other research that has looked at it nationally, including my own, but also in other researchers have looked at it as well. And the bottom line is all vote by mail raises turnout, and it tends to shrink participation gaps between voters of color and white voters. And so in that sense, it has just kind of a generally more consistently positive effect on participation. And so what I want to be clear that what we've looked at here is the VCA's changes to in-person options, and there's this larger backdrop of all vote by mail, which actually has had a positive effect. And we should probably keep that in mind, that it's something we can't, when we look at the comparisons we're looking at here, that's just background. Everybody's got all vote by mail, so we can't pick up any effects of that in what we're doing, nor were we trying to. So I just want to keep in mind that that is actually something that's been happening and has had in the midst of all this other stuff, has had a positive effect on turnout. What do I think accounts for the drop in turnout among Latinos in 2022 and then Black voters in 2024? Why did the Latino voter decline reverse in 2024? Again, excellent question. And I think right now, our best answer for that is that we need to do more detailed research to understand what's going on there, because it's kind of a surprising result. And it's certainly possible that there was, something particular to those elections. And so we want to have a better understanding of how voters in general are engaging with the VCA, and in particular Latino and Black voters, because we see that sometimes see those declines. Why do I think voter turnout rose slightly at the farthest distances? Yeah, so that could be a variety of things. I mentioned one possibility, which is that this dynamic of people saying, well, maybe I'll use my vote by mail ballot and then I'll just mail it in. But if you're closer to it, you kind of hold out the promise of going in person, and it just never happens. That could be one explanation. Another possibility is there are compositional differences. So the voters who are closer into their in-person voting locations may be somewhat less consistent voters than the people who are farther out. So one dimension of that is that the people who are farther out are more rural and they are more likely to be white, and white voters just in general have higher turnout than voters of color. And so as you get closer in, more of the population is voters of color. And so the turnout goes down, but not because of the distance. It's just because of this other factor that's going on. I just do want to emphasize that the differences are pretty small, so it's not a big factor regardless. And take maybe one more question, then we got to wrap things up. But so you broke down turnout based on ethnicity, but would you be able to see differences in turnout based on gender or income levels? Income, no, not with the data that we have, but gender, yes. So we could look at it by gender, and that's certainly something we could explore in future research. All right, so I think that is kind of the end of our program. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I'd also, again, like to thank our funder, the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, for supporting this work. It wouldn't be possible without them. We would really appreciate it if you could take a moment to give us your feedback on this event. If you pre-registered, you'll receive an email later today with a link to a short survey, but you can also scan the QR code on your screen right now in order to comment on the presentation. Please fill this out. It allows us to make the presentations better. Even if you hated the presentation and you thought all of the findings were stupid, we want to hear that too. Believe me. So please fill it out. Let us know. We'd really appreciate it. And with that, I think we'll call it a day. And I appreciate you again coming to this event. And please stay engaged with PPIC in the future. Take care.